The dealership lot was quiet, except for the sound of the diesel engine idling behind her. Callie Ostrander stood beside the tractor she'd bought 8 months earlier, watching a service manager walk around it with a clipboard, checking hours, checking condition, asking questions she answered in short, flat sentences. She was returning a $110,000 tractor. People in her county didn't do that. You bought a machine like this, you kept it, you made it work, you told yourself the payment was the price of staying competitive. Nobody drove it back to the dealership 8 months later and said the math didn't work. What made the decision even harder to explain was what she'd already arranged to buy instead. A 1998 John Deere, bought from a retiring farmer 40 minutes east for $4,000. Her brother-in-law had asked her, the week before, if she'd lost her mind. Her banker hadn't said it outright, but his silence on the phone had said enough. Even the dealership's finance manager, processing her return, kept glancing at her like he expected her to change her mind before the paperwork finished printing. None of them knew what she'd found buried in 8 months of fuel receipts and maintenance invoices. None of them knew what would happen 18 months later during a season that broke 2 of her neighbors and left her farm not just standing, but stronger than it had been before any of this started. This is that story. If you appreciate the kind of hard-earned farming wisdom that saves a family operation when the numbers get tight, stick around and subscribe. We tell these stories every week. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. Callie Ostrander was 42, running 310 acres of corn and soybeans in south-central Iowa. Land that had been in her husband's family for 2 generations before he passed 6 years earlier and left her running the operation alone. She wasn't new to farming. She'd worked the ground alongside him for over a decade before that, and she understood equipment, budgets, and the unglamorous math of a mid-sized row crop operation about as well as anyone in the county. What she didn't have, in the year leading up to the $110,000 purchase, was room for error. Her existing tractor, a machine pushing 22 years old, had started needing repairs often enough that she could no longer plan around it with confidence. A hydraulic failure during planting had cost her nearly a week of lost time the previous spring, and a week during planting season, on land that size, wasn't a small thing. So when the dealership rep laid out the case for a new Tier 4 compliant tractor, better fuel efficiency per claimed hour, GPS auto steer that could cut input overlap and save on seed and chemical costs, a cab quiet enough to run 12-hour days without the fatigue that came with her old machine, and a factory warranty that promised to eliminate the kind of unplanned downtime that had cost her the week before, it didn't sound like recklessness. It sounded responsible. The financing looked manageable on paper, spread across 7 years at a rate her banker called reasonable, given current conditions. Her late husband's cousin, who farmed a much larger operation 2 counties over, told her plainly that modernizing was simply what serious operations did now. Waiting, he said, only cost her efficiency she'd never get back. She signed the papers that winter believing she was doing exactly what a responsible farm owner should do. The tractor, when it arrived, was genuinely impressive. 250 horsepower, a cab that felt more like an office than a piece of machinery, hydraulics precise enough to run implements she'd never have trusted her old tractor with, an auto steer that held a planting line straighter than she ever could by hand. The fuel efficiency numbers, at least on paper, looked strong. The dealership's service department was 30 minutes away instead of the 90-minute drive her old mechanic required. For the first few weeks, she believed she'd made the right call. Then she started paying attention to something the salesman had never really asked her about. How many hours a year would this tractor actually spend earning money on 310 acres? It was a question that hadn't seemed important during the sale. It became impossible to ignore about 4 months in, when she sat down one evening with her fuel logs, her hour meter readings, and her monthly loan statement, and did the kind of arithmetic nobody at the dealership had walked her through. The tractor's monthly payment, once she added insurance and the extended maintenance plan she'd been encouraged to add, came to just under $2,000. Spread across the machine's actual working hours that spring, not the hours it was capable of working, but the hours her farm's size and cropping pattern actually required, the cost per hour of ownership was significantly higher than she'd estimated when she signed the loan. The tractor wasn't sitting idle out of neglect. It was sitting idle because a 300-acre operation, even a well-run one, simply didn't generate enough field hours to justify a machine built for an operation 2 or 3 times its size. The auto steer, that was supposed to save on inputs, saved her real money, but not nearly enough, on her acreage, to offset a payment sized for a much larger farm. The tractor wasn't broken. That was the uncomfortable part. It worked exactly as advertised. The problem wasn't the machine. The problem was that she had matched a machine's capability to her ambitions instead of to her actual acreage. She kept telling herself, for another few months, that the math would even out, that as she got more efficient, as she learned the technology, the numbers would start making sense. But a soybean price dip that autumn made the payment land harder than she'd planned for, and when she calculated her true cost per acre for machinery that season, it was higher than it had been with her unreliable 22-year-old tractor, hydraulic failure included. Returning the tractor wasn't a decision she made quickly, and it wasn't one she made without real cost to her pride. She called the dealership in November, and the conversation was uncomfortable in a way she hadn't fully anticipated. There were early termination fees. There was a conversation about depreciation that made clear she'd absorb a real financial loss simply for having owned the machine 8 months. The finance manager asked her, more than once, whether she'd considered refinancing instead, whether the real problem might be a bad season rather than a bad decision. Her brother-in-law, when she mentioned what she was planning, didn't hide his confusion. "You're going to eat a loss on a brand new tractor," he said, "to go buy something older than some of your equipment already sitting in your shed." She didn't have a fully confident answer for him yet. What she had was a spreadsheet, a hard number for what the $110,000 tractor was actually costing her per productive hour, and a growing certainty that the machine's impressiveness had never been the same thing as its value to her specific operation. The John Deere she found that December had faded green paint, a cracked vinyl seat patched with duct tape, and just under 6,000 hours on a meter that had clearly seen honest work rather than abuse. The previous owner, a man retiring after 40 years on the same 80 acres, walked her through its maintenance history from memory. A rebuilt transmission a decade back, routine fluid changes, nothing hidden, nothing dressed up for a sale. It had none of the technology the new tractor offered. No auto steer, no climate-controlled cab beyond a factory heater that worked if you were patient with it. No GPS guidance of any kind. What it had was a simple mechanical design that any competent local mechanic could service without a laptop. Parts available from 3 different suppliers within an hour's drive, and a purchase price that didn't require a loan at all. She paid cash, $4,000, and the tractor was entirely hers, free and clear, the same afternoon. What she couldn't have known yet was whether it could actually handle the work. The first real test came in late winter, running a manure spreader and handling some basic tillage on ground she wasn't planting until spring. It wasn't glamorous work, and the John Deere wasn't fast at it. But it started every cold morning without complaint. It burned a fraction of the fuel her newer machine had, and when a hydraulic hose blew in February, the repair cost her $60 in parts and an afternoon of her own labor, rather than a service call and a wait for a dealership technician. That was when the real questions started to take shape in her mind. Was the old tractor itself the advantage, or was the real advantage everything she could now afford to do, simply because she wasn't sending $2,000 a month to a lender? Because within weeks of eliminating that payment, she found herself with cash on hand for the first time in over a year. She used part of it to finally replace a worn-out grain auger she'd been limping along for 2 seasons. She built a small cash reserve instead of running her operating line close to its limit the way she'd grown used to doing. This was the lesson that eventually reshaped how she thought about every piece of equipment on her farm, not just the tractor. The cheapest machine isn't automatically the most profitable one, and the most impressive machine isn't automatically the right one either. The right machine is whichever one's total cost, purchase price, financing, depreciation, fuel, maintenance, and the value of the hours it actually works, makes sense for the specific job it needs to do. A $110,000 tractor could absolutely be the right decision for an operation with enough acreage and enough annual field hours to justify it. Her farm at 310 acres simply wasn't that operation. Not yet, and maybe not ever, depending on how her land base changed. The old John Deere wasn't a miracle. It proved that clearly enough that April, when its transmission started slipping during a long day of fieldwork. The repair, done by her regular mechanic instead of a dealership technician, came to just under $3,000. A real expense, one that stung to write the check for. But sitting with that repair bill that evening, she ran the comparison that had become second nature to her by then. 18 months of ownership on the John Deere, including that transmission repair, still cost her dramatically less than a single year's worth of payments, insurance, and maintenance plan fees on the tractor she'd returned. The setback didn't undo the decision. It just proved the decision had never been about avoiding all future costs. It had been about making sure whatever costs came were ones her farm could actually absorb. That spring, she started applying the same thinking beyond the tractor. She looked hard at her input cost, negotiated a better arrangement on seed with a neighboring farmer buying in bulk together, and began tracking machinery utilization the way she once would have tracked crop yields alone. She wasn't building a cheap farm. She was building a farm with lower fixed costs and more room to breathe when conditions turned difficult, which, in farming, they eventually always do. That test came the following year, when a dry summer cut yields across the region and soybean prices fell at the same time input costs climbed. Neighbors carrying large equipment payments felt the squeeze immediately. Several had to renegotiate loans or delay planned upgrades entirely. One nearby operation, financed heavily on newer machinery, ended up selling off a parcel of land just to cover its equipment debt through the lean year. Callie's farm felt the same drought, the same weak prices, but without a $2,000 monthly payment eating into her margin regardless of yield, she had room the others didn't. She covered the season's shortfall from the cash reserve she'd built, without borrowing against next year's crop. Her brother-in-law, stopping by that fall to help with harvest, looked at her books without her having to explain much. "I didn't understand what you were doing when you sent that tractor back," he admitted. "Thought you were panicking." "I wasn't panicking," she told him. "I was just finally looking at what the machine actually needed to earn versus what it was going to cost me, no matter what." By the following spring, the lower overhead she'd built had given her something most of her neighbors didn't have during a difficult stretch for the industry: options. She used cash, not new debt, to buy 40 acres from a retiring neighbor who needed a quick, straightforward sale. She purchased a second used implement outright rather than financing it. She never had to have the conversation her neighbor had, the one about selling land, just to make an equipment payment. Standing in her machine shed 2 years after that quiet, uncomfortable afternoon at the dealership, Callie sometimes looks at the old John Deere parked beside newer equipment she's since bought carefully, with cash, when the numbers actually justified it. The $110,000 tractor was never a bad machine. It would have been the right decision for a bigger operation, one with enough hours of real work to spread across that cost. Her mistake hadn't been buying impressive equipment. It had been buying equipment sized for the farm she wished she had, instead of the one she actually operated. The $4,000 tractor didn't save her farm by being cheap. It saved her farm by finally forcing her to ask the only question that ever really mattered. Not what a machine could do, but what it would actually cost her to own it, and whether her farm could survive that cost when the good years eventually turned hard.